Hello there! So, I said I was going to make this video a little while ago, which will go through the full event timeline for DML and everything that went wrong with DML throughout the years. DML was released in January 2015, and I started playing the game in January 15. I saw close to every single event, update, community manager change, and the lot. Luckily, I also have an entire YouTube channel to go through which can show us exactly what the game used to be like during the years. It does go without saying, but these are very obviously my own opinions, and while I may speak to other DML players frequently, I can only really speak for myself and how I view these changes that happened over the years. Oh, and if I missed anything, sorry, trying to remember 8 years of game history means I am going to end up missing something, I know. So when DML was released, it was pretty bare bones in the fact that there weren't actually any events and such going on like DML has today. The first few months, players were just breeding all of the basic breedable dragons while also trying to breed the dragons of the week and month. And let me tell you, trying to breed the dragons of the month with 2 hatchery slots, 1 breeding den, and no relics was actually a pretty tough ask. So a lot of players missed these quite often. Getting through the main map, leveling up dragons, that was pretty much the whole game. It was just a breeding game with a campaign map. Very simple, very basic, but it was enough to keep people interested while trying to finish off the breedables and the Dragon of the Weeks. In June 2015, we got the first dungeon in DML, which was essentially a double wave of enemy opponents that you had to take down. It wasn't particularly interesting, but it didn't take long either. However, the biggest problem with this dungeon was that when you had special events on, the reward dragon was completely RNG. Nothing you did could get the reward dragon for you, as it was just a simple, pick one of the final 3 rewards. And to really stab the knife in, they would also show you if you missed the reward dragon in one of the other chests. So this was the first real addition to the game, and honestly, I didn't like it. Anything that took away a player's ability to change the final outcome to me is something that I don't enjoy, and unfortunately for DML, this was only the beginning of their rampant use of gacha loot boxes, but at this point, it had very minimal impact on gameplay. We did also have the arena back at the start, which gave a few more minutes of gameplay, but again, wasn't anything particularly interesting and works similarly to the current arena in terms of gameplay, except it was actually balanced in a way back then. The first big breeding update happened in August 2015, where the Light and Shadow update came in and brought the first new basic element dragons for us to breed with Light and Shadow. It brought with it a couple of interesting bugs and more map to complete, which players needed at this point since they'd, for the most part, finished the map, but essentially, the basic gameplay elements were being expanded and updated at this point, 7 months after release. This was, unfortunately, the last major breeding update the game would ever receive. Yeah, a breeding simulation game that hasn't had a major basic breeding update in over 7 years. That's DML. It's worth noting that we were getting Easter, Halloween, and Christmas updates for the game at this stage. However, they didn't really have proper dedicated events of any kind to start with. They just added festive themed dragons to the game. The only real event was putting a new dragon in the dungeon as a potential reward, which was a bit, well, uninteresting for those that didn't get the dragon through RNG. They'd hold contests involving YouTubers, and the newly released Dragon of the Week posts were interesting because these were for dragons that we'd never seen or heard about before. We did get the first VIP update in November 2015, which brought out the VIP breedable dragons, and since this day, DML has never really added any additional breedable VIP dragons. You'll notice a pattern with the game where the major updates to basic gameplay all happened very early on, and since then, these parts of the game have either been completely ignored or barely touched at all. Either way, there were like 240 available dragons around this point, including boss dragons, but most players hadn't even hit 200 dragons collected at this stage. In December 2015, DML had a Light plus Shadow Factions event where players would pick a team and fight in the arena for the chance to earn prizes. Honestly, I really didn't mind this, and it gave some good incentive to playing the arena, which otherwise gave very minimal rewards at this stage, but it was a very community-driven event, as this was the closest DML that really ever came to some sort of PvP system outside of clan events. On December 18th, 2015, we had a Christmas solo event, which works similarly to how DML solo events work now, except the event was 10 days long and had 10 tiers. Collecting gold, feeding dragons, and catching creatures were some of the quests, so since this point, DML never really ever changed how this event works. However, one thing to note about these solo events is that they included 2 event-exclusive dragons just in the regular event milestones. They contained a festive habitat and 2 breedables, some of which many players didn't get around to breeding yet. They still had max pool cooldowns, wait timers, and the event had a couple of days of login leeway too, but I would say that these sorts of solo events becoming more frequent was actually the beginning of DML's major problems. Players still had dragons to breed, so if they wanted to ignore the events, it wasn't so bad. But later on, this wouldn't be the case. In February 2016, Update 1.9 was released, which allowed for players to finally rename their dragons. The level cap was increased to level 85, gifts for max level players were now given, new arena leagues, and there were a few other changes. However, there was a very much not so good change that happened to DML with Update 1.92. The portal gem limit and gift expiration change. Before, portal gems in DML had no max cap, which meant that if you added thousands of other players and you all gifted each other, it would be a close to endless supply of portal gems. I understand why Gameloft wouldn't have wanted this to be a thing as a company, but as this was directly tied to how active you were and how many friends you have added, this forced the players to be sociable and add lots of players. This, in my opinion, was the true beginning of DML's very slippery slope towards stinting player progress, although the cap at this stage was 1500 portal gems, so honestly, most players didn't even have close to that number, so it wasn't a big problem for most. But for any massive hoarders, they weren't too happy about this change. It was also announced at this stage that clans were coming to the game, and so everyone was really interested to see if this portal gem change had some relation to the new clan changes that would be introduced. Solo events, basic breeding, Dragon of the Weeks, and Dragon of the Month breeding continued up to March 2016, which was when clan events were first released in DML. Many players saw this as an amazing moment in DML history where they finally got to find their clan family and could finally feel like they were a part of something really fun and interesting with other players that they could actually chat with in the game. Personally, I was more interested in the clan dragons that were released, but one thing I will say is that despite a minority of players talking about clans as if they were the best thing in DML, from its release in March 2016, clans, in the way that they work, only actually received 3 clan dragon updates after this. I'm not talking about the 2-headed clan dragons, I mean the actual available to collect clan dragons. There was the release of clan dragons, and a couple more updates for this, and that was it. DML clans never saw another update again. Although Gameloft are apparently currently working on the clan's revamp as of December 2022, but just think, the central multiplayer experience to DML, in terms of dragon rewards, only saw 3 additional updates in a 6-year period. Clans, unfortunately, would end up being one of the most broken, buggy, unbalanced parts of DML in the coming years, with clans exploiting clan bugs in order to gain a ridiculous amount of gems that would then use them to outgem their opponents. Some people would just spend money to become the superior clan, with no real reward for doing so. The addition of clans wasn't a problem in itself, but the way this part of DML was handled the lack of updates, the lack of bug fixing to stop the gem exploiting and other issues for years makes this, in the year 2022, one of the worst parts of the game. Not only just because of how ungodly boring and unrewarding the clan events are, but the later updates that included clan dragons such as Feather just made this part of the game extremely unbalanced and also bred a really toxic mentality in clans, where some clans would expect their players to sit there doing clan events for entire weekends in order to boost the dragon to win the next clan event. The only reward being a feather piece or two if they already had it though, there was nothing of value. Unless you care about beating other players in a non-skill based video game which proves nothing of your value as a player, most players by this point completely lost interest in this part of the game. After you collect the clan pack dragons and other clan dragon rewards, there is nothing else enticing players to play this part of the game. Yet you'll still get clan leaders that are stuck in 2015, 2016 clans, pretending as if this was part of the game, and as if this was somehow interesting and valuable. Gameloft was still updating the game with new features back in 2016, but basic gameplay mechanics started to get ignored from this point, which really started a downhill trend of players and revenue leaving by the mid to end of 2017. However, another major change to the events in DML was about to take place in May 2016, when DML began teasing their castle events, along with adding some additional updates to clans in DML. Castle updates in DML were the start of DML becoming much more reliant on reset timers for players to achieve event goals. The first castle event in particular went very badly for a lot of players because before this, there was never any need to keep a team full of lots of different elements and balanced dragons. Everyone was just kind of doing whatever the hell they wanted with their teams. This event type alone completely changed how players had to think about managing their teams, and honestly, it was not for the better. If you wanted to use a smoke, ceremony, and melon dragon back then, you could if you wanted. There was nothing really stopping you. But the dawn of castle events meant that now, players really needed 3 element dragons on their team in order to cover as many elements as possible. Players didn't really know this at the time because it wasn't really communicated to them, but when they started playing the first castle event, it quickly became apparent that a lot of players simply had no chance whatsoever of finishing this event because of the restrictions that Gameloft had added to the event. It was deemed so difficult that I ended up even making a video back then titled, "The Forgotten Castle Event is Not Impossible," because, just like solo events in the past, a good portion of the regular players believed that this type of event was outright impossible due to the reliance on logging in at certain times. Of course, nobody had a team ready either, so not only was this a mess due to the new resets-based system, which we'd never had before, but later on, we were restricted to just a couple of elements that we could use. So a massive portion of the player base failed to complete this event. Luckily, Gameloft did improve the event in terms of elemental restrictions later on, but many players left after failing this castle event and wanted nothing to do with these sorts of resets as they just simply couldn't work it into their daily schedule. One thing to note, however, is that despite this original castle event being just 5 levels over a 7-day period, we were able to get dragon card packs and 2 time-limited dragons for playing this event, which I guess was okay for rewards, but nothing particularly special. We got the first charity event in DML in June 2016, which was an event that players seemed to like for the most part. All that you needed to do was collect golden paws and spend them on your favourite animal so that then when the event was over, they'd add the most popular into the game. This was all based around animal charities, so it had a direct impact for those particular animal charity groups. It also allowed the chosen content creators to bring in some more players from their channel since they were invited to this event too. So overall it seemed to be received pretty well, but Gameloft would only ever host a couple more events like this after this point. These charity events were always quite simple and easy to take part in, which is sort of necessary if you're looking to bring in more players, but unfortunately, the majority of these new players would leave as the game became more reset based and unfortunately more pay to win. We actually had another faction based event in June 2016 which was football themed, and you got to once again pick a team, which was France or Germany, and do arena battles to be in the running for the prized footy dragon. I don't know why these events stopped in the end, but we never really saw them again after this point. We got some new contests, solo events, and a new island after this until August 2016, where the enchantment system was released. This was a completely new, basic game element that was an outright addition to the game. We also got all of the new enchantment breedable dragons, another new island, increased dragon level to level 80, 40 new dragons, and a new campaign map. This update added a lot of new basic gameplay features that honestly were really needed because a lot of players had finished all of the things added from the previous major update. It was a well-timed update, however one issue with the Enchantment League is that the new added part of the game is that it required a ton of grinding. Essentially, Enchantment Leagues was just very time-consuming. Before it was just do your map battles, arena battles, and any current events. But now we also had enchantment arena battles to do. I didn't mind it too much because it actually gave something extra to do in the game. But at the same time, the grind was just too long to upgrade all of our dragons. The funny thing is, I say that now, but the grind in the current 2022 Enchanted Arena is much longer and much worse. Especially since we have a lot more enchantment stars now. A lot of players complained in 2016 about how grindy the Enchantment League was. So if you think that these days, the time required to grind enchantment mats for Divines and Ancients, for example, is like 50 times worse than that, you can see how DML changed to become such a tedious mess over time. Just to give you an idea of how negative players were already about these grindy, annoying reset-based events, I even released another video titled in 2016 called DML Solo Events Are Not, in quotes, pay to win. And by this, I meant that the event itself doesn't require a player to spend to finish them, as they are doable in the allotted time frame. However, a group of players and clans had started a mass revolt against Gameloft for how pay-to-win things such as solo events were. Yes, that's right. They did that for solo events. You know, the events in 2022 that a lot of players deemed to be one of the most player-friendly and doable events. Yeah, in 2016, players absolutely hated it, and most of the players couldn't finish these events. My main complaint was that a lot of players at the time complained that the event was outright rigged against them. Lower level players couldn't complete solos and so on, which just wasn't remotely true. However, one thing I could understand is that this event just wasn't player friendly to players that simply couldn't log in. However, complaining to Gameloft about an event being outright pay to win, when it isn't, IMO is the wrong way to go about any criticism, because if you use reasons that simply aren't true to justify complaining and mass revolting, the developers just aren't going to listen because, well, they know that it isn't true. Although, I will say that I don't think I sympathized quite enough with these players, because although these players were wrong about the event being outright impossible, what they may have actually wanted to say but didn't know how to say it was that the event wasn't possible for them. And I mean, I was in that boat for DML for the whole last year. I just simply could not finish solo events, cake crazes, or other short-timer reset-reliant events with my current life schedule. DML should have been doing everything it could to retain these players, but unfortunately for us all, they actually went in the opposite direction a year after this. Things continued much the same until December 2016, where another update was announced for clans, and this would introduce the two-headed clan dragons that clans would have to breed for. This update, for the most part, was fine, and actually gave people an incentive to play the clan events again, since most had finished the other clan dragons, but the two-headed clan dragons each had their own special uses outside of clan events that made some of them very appealing. One of them boosted damage, for example, which was incredibly useful in the arena, and made glass cannon teams more desirable, because since you always went first, certain dragons like the Autumn Dragon would essentially be guaranteed a one-hit kill. There was no reason to have a defensive team if you were guaranteed a one-hit on your opponents. These clan dragons were very useful, and so, in order to use them, you needed to do clan things every now and then, as a minimum. It gave the clans some sort of use, again, which wouldn't last forever. For a while, DML didn't really have many other major changes. It had its calendar events, which happened pretty frequently, solo events, castle events for major festive periods. We got the Chronos changes in February 2017, which allowed for treasure exploration for rune shards, which was an interesting and useful update for players. But 2017, in my opinion, was the year where DML truly started to go downhill. Not in terms of basic gameplay mechanics, but this was the point where the game became much more obviously pay-to-win, reset-based, and gacha-orientated. This was also shortly after Vivendi had taken over Gameloft, and I don't think it was a coincidence that after this point, things started to change. The first time where I started to really notice this was in February 2017, where we got the weekly card pack dragons. Kitty, the dragon that brings back nightmares for me. The dragons available changed weekly, and Kitty needed 20 pieces to unlock. This probably sounds pretty standard today, but back then, considering how low the drop rates were from the card packs, my 16,000 clan points that I'd collected netted me 0 pieces. There were also other community members that reported spending 150,000 clan points to get 11 pieces of the dragon. The drop rates were absurdly low, and these were the points that a player had been collecting for months, if not years. And they couldn't even get you a single new weekly card pack dragon. Players were livid. This was obviously meant to be outright pay to win to obtain them from the highest tier gem packs. They were fuming, but Gameloft didn't seem to care very much. It was a bad start to DML in 2017, as the next update in March 2017 would bring out changes to the gifting system. But the biggest, arguably, one of the worst changes ever added to DML was the portal changes nerf. The new gifting system meant that gifts were now randomized, whereas before you knew what you were gifting and what you would receive, and at this point they added the Enchantress Dragon to the gifting pool, which, to this day, has remained the same. But the portal gems change. Remembering how upset some players were that when they reduced the unlimited gems to 1,500, well, this particular update limited our portal gems from 1,500 to a measly 200 portal gems. It's not like this was a minor nerf. This was absolutely gigantic. And for those of us that had been playing since the start with unlimited portal gems, and these now being randomized as well, players were livid. A set of clans even tried to get everyone to give the game a 1-star review before the update hit, just to make their complaints heard by Gameloft. The problem was, we didn't have all of the details confirmed at this time for exactly what was gonna happen. Once they were nerfed to 200, would there be a new way to earn energy? Would there be less reliance on the map? I took a more hesitant stance at the time, and advised for players to wait until the update was actually released, and then go and complain and leave your reviews if you're unhappy. If they gave us no other way to earn these portal gems, which apparently this take annoyed a lot of clans, and to this day, a few clans have a hate boner for me for simply trying to be logical about when we actually submit our 0-star reviews. But I digress. Either way, they didn't provide anything to make up for this nerf. It was simply deal with it. So yeah, this successfully pissed off just about anyone that did map battles, and now suddenly our gold-earning resource in the form of the map was severely limited, and now it was going to be very tough for players to finish off as many battles as they wanted in the day, as the gifts were now random. DML in 2022 just accepts that this is how it is. But back then, it was an absolutely massive change to the game that was majorly detrimental, and the players were very, very sour about it. We received more islands after this, along with the new Dragon's Delight events in June 2017. They were the most skill-based events that the game had seen up to this point, although the item drop RNG was still a bit too much for my liking. A lot of players actually disliked this event because they said that it was too complicated, but I myself didn't like it because it was still a reset-based event and still had a massive reliance on RNG. The biggest problem with the event, however, was the introduction of leaderboard event dragons. This first prize only dragon that just one person in the leaderboard would win. This made these events incredibly uninteresting to a lot of players, myself included. So once you got to the final milestone of 130 points, you would typically just stop playing. Gameloft made improvements to Dragon's Delight events over time, but I have to say that this leaderboard dragon introduction always irked me, and I was never a fan of these events for that reason. The two-headed Clan Dragons update came in July 2017, and new clan leagues were announced, which gave the more competitively driven players in clans something to be interested about. Some more Clan Dragons to earn, new Clan Dragon abilities, clans became somewhat interesting once again, for a short time. August 2017 was, arguably, one of the most game-changing times in DML history. In August, we had a teaser and special community-driven event related to the release of the brand new Divine Dragons. Players had to hatch millions of hybrid dragons in order to unlock Hypnos and Aphrodite. At least that's what Gameloft said, but the authenticity of this score was... well, it was very obvious that Gameloft were going to release them anyway, and they'd been known to bot their social media posts and such in the past, so it's believed that this bar was not actually legitimate in any way. But they did a good job of pretending it was, and players felt like they were doing a good job, telling everyone to log in and breed hybrid dragons to unlock these new divines, one in a calendar event and one in a breeding event. It did seem like everyone was rallying together to unlock these new dragons, so despite the fact that this was almost certainly a fabricated score bar, it made the players hyped for this new event style. One that would, in the end, become the most important event type in DML. On September 1st, 2017, Dragolympus Rising was released, the first divine event in DML. We had a castle event during this time, along with these new gacha divine chests, which were absolute hell. The first castle event had 11 levels and lasted 10 days. The rewards from these castle events are something that I really do want to note, because in these 11 castle event levels, you could get your hands on the new Divine Hermes and Hades dragons, another event exclusive dragon, a rare enchantment chest, and 150 gems. Yes, you heard that right. 150 gems for a 10-day long event. Guaranteed. This part was fun. Although, the castle was still based on 6-hour resets of logging in. But the event had a couple of days leeway, so even if you missed a reset a day, it was just about doable. However, the divine chests alongside this event were the worst introduction by far. There were no guaranteed chests, and even getting the rare and epics out of these chests was close to impossible for most players, unless you spent an insane amount of money on chest opening. But there were no guarantees in these chests, no guaranteed divine pieces, so many players spent money on these chests, and even after opening tons of them, they got 0 or very few pieces of the Zeus and Hephaestus dragons. Not only this, these new divine gacha chests actually broke the Apple Store rules too, because the drops weren't disclosed anywhere in the game, which was highly illegal. I know of one person in particular, not me, who put in a direct complaint about the game not disclosing the chest odds, as this shouldn't be allowed on the store. Very shortly after, drop rates magically started appearing for divine events. How very odd. Either way, the castle events were seen as very rewarding, but the divine chests were hated by most of the players, so these events were deemed as very 50-50 in terms of how good or bad they were. However, those players that were already sick of RNG from things like card packs saw this as the last straw, and a lot of players began leaving after this first divine event. Even though we also got a breeding event for Aphrodite and a calendar event for Hypnos, The RNG gacha chests alone meant that the grand majority of players would never be able to collect all of the event divines. So a lot of long-time players left, feeling defeated by these gacha chests. Gameloft did improve these eventually, but we had a few divine events with these loot box chests that were very much hated by a lot of players, and understandably so. Other games were also throwing in gacha loot boxes around this time, and gamers of all types were becoming really sick of them. This was obviously Gameloft's way of getting in on this trend, but it really did turn away a lot of players after this. Surprisingly, going into 2018, that's when Gameloft as a whole started to go down the stinker in terms of revenue, and it just kept dropping and dropping and dropping, and has never really recovered since. Is it a coincidence that as Gameloft's games, such as DML and Asphalt, after the Vivendi takeover, started to implement more gacha RNG mechanics, and then their earnings started to tank? Is it really a coincidence? Or was it a direct reflection of how players were beginning to view and not spend quite as much on their games? In October 2017, we got a new island, we got VIP changes, and finally, we got a speed up button so we could finally go from ×1 speed fights to ×2. This speed update alone made the game much less of a pain to play because 1x speed DML used to take far too long to do the regular daily tasks. This was a godsend, although nowhere near as impactful as the eventual ×4 speed that we're used to today. In November 2017, some really good changes took place for the Clan Siege event and made it a little bit more rewarding, so the clans were happy again. For a short while, until this became insanely boring and repetitive once again. The first Farming Frenzy event occurred in January 2018, which is where they started to add more of these mini-events to draw excitement, but DML stayed much the same until February 2018, where the second ever Divine event was released. This was more or less a copy plus paste of the first event, 10-day long castle, multiple divines available, breedable divine in the form of Pango in the end, with Erlang Shen available in the calendar event. Players were more used to the divine castle events now and seemed to not mind them so much, although players still had a major issue with the divine chests, which hadn't really undergone any improvements, so many ignored the Changi Thought Dragon and other rewards as they simply weren't achievable. We had the Egyptian event after this, which included dragons like Anubis and Isis, with more unobtainable major chest rewards for any non-whales. The next notable update was in August 2018, which brought 4 additional enchantment stars, increase of the max dragon level to level 100, ascension, new arena reward dragons, and codex collections were finally a thing, which gave tons of free extra gems for finishing collections, but this was also the time that breeding token things became a thing. Skill changes and new map parts were released, and this honestly gave a hefty wad of content for people to enjoy for a while, especially because of the dragon level increase. However, in September 2018, things started to go downhill for Gameloft once again when they decided, for some reason, goodness knows why, they decided to re-release the original castle event, almost tile for tile, with a new legendary in it. The elemental restrictions, which they'd improved slightly in the divine events and any other castle events made in recent years, were all lost, and they gave a replica of the first ever castle event. Players once again complained that they couldn't finish this event due to the elemental restrictions, couldn't understand why Gameloft just decided to undo all the good changes they implemented in the castle events. It was bizarre, to say the least. But weirdly enough, for castle events in particular, Gameloft had a thing for improving them, then suddenly losing all of the improvements they made in the next event. This happened multiple times over the next few years, and every time, players would grow more and more annoyed by this, as they were clearly capable of giving players more rewarding, enjoyable events, but just chose not to. DML trotted on without much to note until January 2019, where we had what can only be called a joke chain breeding event for the Cosmos Dragon. This event, I think, really cemented the fact that whoever is developing the game and whoever is doing event update checks, they were really not very knowledgeable about the game whatsoever, as this chain breeding event showed that we needed to breed together a boiling plus ice dragon to breed a water dragon, to then breed that with the new event exclusive Ice Feather Dragon. Except you absolutely did not need to breed a water dragon. You could just buy the water dragon from the shop and then breed it with the event dragon to try and breed this old Cosmos legendary. It just seemed like the event team wasn't really playing their own game and didn't really understand how anything worked. Otherwise, there is no way this event would have ever gone live like that. The Ice Feather itself was also a problem, and the start of another problem in DML where, in order for Gameloft to try and force breeding in a way that was as stressful as possible, they'd make chain breeding events where you needed to get the dragon, or dragons, from a currently ongoing event, hatch them, then breed them, to even have a chance of breeding the chain breeding event dragon. The problem was, most of the events took 90% plus of the event time to get the reward dragon, meaning that you would have a day max to try and breed these returning legendary dragons in the chain breeding events. It was an obvious attempt at trying to force gem spending on breeding, or force you to buy the event dragon early, but this just turned off a lot of players, and unless a player got lucky on the first couple of breeds, these chain breeding event dragons were usually out of reach. We also had boss challenge events in 2018, which honestly weren't too bad, but they still required logins that were way too frequent at the start of the event. For those players who had a lot of time away from the game due to work or school, these events were incredibly difficult. Doable if you could log in, but very similar to solo events in terms of their login requirements, which made a lot of players dislike this event type. It wasn't a particularly interesting event type, but it unfortunately also included elemental restrictions similar to the castle events, meaning that some players just couldn't finish these events because of the elemental restrictions present. It's a shame really, because Gameloft was so dead set on forcing more restrictions so players would be forced to make their teams in a certain way, but compared to a later update, these elemental restrictions were mere child's play. And then we had Heroes Challenge, which is probably my favourite DML event of all time, which we didn't really have any major focus on it, and they just dropped the event at some point. Maybe it wasn't making enough money, but I wish that that would return at least one day. Then in March 2019, we got Chrono Divines, which were, I would say, the most pay-to-win event type DML had received up to this point, easily. They took the old Divine-style events, made them less rewarding in every possible way, including taking away all the gems we could earn in the castle event, and the gacha loot box chests becoming the staple part of the event. They re-released Hermes in these events and allowed players to collect Chrono Hades, but everything that players were given in the usual Divine events was just stripped back and worse in every way when the Chrono Divines came into the game. Very few people spent enough money to get all of the Chrono Dragons and Chrono Chronos, and guess what? To this day, they have never re-released Chrono Chronos, even though these Chrono Divine events started in March 2019. It wasn't viewed very fondly by the players I spoke to, and honestly, seeing how reliant everything was on the gacha chests, I lost interest in these events completely. That doesn't mean it was impossible to get Divines free to play. You definitely could by playing through the events, but the gacha chests were just still far too much for a lot of players to handle. After this, we got the Stronger Together charity event in April 2019, where I actually got my YouTube logo in the game, thanks to a series of fortunate and unfortunate events behind the scenes at Gameloft. This allowed you to make donations to unlock some cool rewards, up to 4,500 gems if you donated enough to get 15 million points, which would have been a lot of cash. But considering that this was for a charity event, I didn't even mind. This is a time where being a whale wasn't actually really much of a bad thing. Maybe a bad thing for your bank account, but not for the charities that you were helping to support through the game. Overall, it was a nice and relaxing event, despite the fact that some rewards were very obviously donation only, but it was a good event in theory. It also gave us some free legendary dragons too, so that was neat. A major change to DML was just around the corner, and this happened in July 2019. This was the release of the new Bottomless Dungeon. This update alone is one of my least favourite things that ever happened to DML, although I have a love-hate relationship with it, for many reasons. When the Bottomless Dungeon released, most players were still using arena dragons that were all about heavy hitting or one-shotting. So dragons that had plant and shadow were still the kings of the meta by far. Once this new Bottomless Dungeon released, players couldn't really do too much because barely anyone had a water dragon in their team, earth dragons weren't in teams either. Basically, the game used to be fully focused on offense, and this new Bottomless Dungeon was primarily about staying alive as long as possible. So while there were tons of new dungeon dragons to collect, which I never collected at the end, most players just sort of lived with whatever score their main team could get, unless they could afford to add an earth dragon and a water dragon, but back then, without sigils, nobody could really do too great in the dungeon. It was more of a, just play however far you can go, and maybe some dragons, maybe you'll get some eventually. It was just a different part of the game that wasn't really that important at the time. We also got 3 more clan dragons added for clans to grind in July, but nothing else really of note. Players kept complaining about Chrono divines, gacha chests and such, but DML continued on until November 2019. November 2019 was the first time we got a look at the brand new Ancient events in DML with an early access preview. Most players assumed that Ancients would likely be like Divine Dragons, something stronger than Legends, but not something you absolutely had to add to your team, assuming Arena Dragons could still one-shot them, which they could. Maybe they'd have some use in the dungeon, but not much more than the existing dragons. And for the most part, at this stage, that was true. We got the brand new Dragon Board event, Double Trouble Battles, and another Breeding Blitz event that I complained about. Dragon Board was a lot for players to get their heads around at first, and also had the super annoying bingo mechanic that ended up being a massive bait for players to waste a lot of their currency on dragons that were significantly harder to get than they needed to be. Ancient events had lots of dragons in them, but they were a month long and had a lot of annoying, unnecessary things that made them a massive slog. Plus, the dungeon had now become an important part of this event, as there were tickets available in the dungeon too, meaning that players were becoming more and more uneasy about these events, as the way to get tickets was to do dungeon, but their teams weren't really made for the dungeon. There was no really great way to stay alive for a long time because, well, teams weren't made to be like that. But more players were picking up some defensive options and playing around to see if they could get more ancient tickets in the dungeon because, well, they wanted these event dragons without having to spend stupid amounts of money on them. But the gacha chests were still a major problem because, once again, there was no guarantee of a specific ancient drop. Although at least now we had guaranteed chests and dragon pieces based on chest opens, so in theory, there was an absolute maximum a whale would have to spend to guarantee a specific dragon, which was many, many hundreds of dollars, but the chest drops themselves had no drops guaranteed. A lot of players got a first ancient in the form of Ikez, since he was available after finishing a collection that included the other epics, rares, and the legendary chest dragon from the event. He was doable free to play, and it at least gave players a dragon to use and test that was an ancient. We were getting ancient events mixed with chrono events, each lasting a month each, and players were getting a bit bored of these super long repetitive events. But June 11th, 2020 was the day that DML had what I would say was the biggest change the game ever received. Sigils. DML sigils, while adding new levels of strategy to the game, I would say, were the worst thing that ever happened to DML. The reason for this being that earning sigils is completely RNG from the gacha loot boxes. They cost way too much to upgrade, and they're incredibly unbalanced to this day. Sigils were released in June 2020, and yet, 2.5 years later, we still only have about 5 sigils that are actually used on our teams. Plus, when sigils were released, there were so many bugs, including a major acceptance bug that wasn't allowing the sigil to work correctly, but on release, the biggest problem was the HP that these sigils added to dragons. Adding even uncommon sigils to your dragons would cause a fight that used to take 1 turn to instead take about 15 turns. No, I am not exaggerating. It was incredibly overinflated, and doing any battles at all during this time was pure hell. Thank goodness this was fixed, because trying to do dungeon during this time with these sigils was like staring at a wall and watching paint dry. Everything in DML became a huge slog, and instead of taking 20 minutes to do your daily tasks, it would easily take over an hour. But the extra HP was eventually reduced to an acceptable amount, and battles mostly went back to normal. Except, now players realised there were certain sigil combos that were incredibly overpowered, and they used these to clear a way into the new DML meta. First off, it started with Purity plus Daredevil. Since back then most players were still using very high damage dragons, mostly based around Arena. Clearing the map suddenly became a breeze, and newer players got a massive advantage suddenly and were able to collect so much more in terms of resources from the main map with lower level dragons. This was a really good thing for the new players. However, once the acceptance bug got fixed, a new problem emerged. Suddenly, Wonder plus Acceptance became a close to unstoppable sigil combination. Once this was tested a bit more and players realised just how insanely overpowered this was, they tried this with Bless, which sent this into orbit levels of overpowered. This was the point where the longer standing players realised that their old one-shotting arena teams were going to be thrown into retirement because there was a new king, and that king was Divine Bless with Wonder Acceptance. Even Ancients benefited massively from using Wonder plus Acceptance, so now these Divines that people have been collecting over the last couple of years suddenly became essential to every single team. Once people started getting rare sigils and above, more testing was done with Ancients, and players were able to find out that the Ancient element actually achieves more in itself while holding Witchcraft over Wonder. So then Ancient plus Divine was seen as the staple combination in the dungeon and in all parts of the game. But the big problem was that the only way to earn sigils was through RNG loot boxes and a very slow sigil map. But the trinkets were incredibly hard to come by, so actually upgrading sigils seemed like it would take months. And still to this day, that hasn't been improved. It's gacha loot boxes once again that we have to rely on to get essential items to use on our event-limited dragons to do well in the Bottomless Dungeon to grind more tickets. The reality hadn't really sunk in at first, but because these sigils and event dragons with exception stats were so easy to monetize, Gameloft decided to use this as the central way to generate revenue from this point onwards, much to the detriment of the majority of the player base that barely had a couple of divines yet. The sigil map campaign was the start of my mini DML is shit series, which is a point where I begin to lose all faith in DML ever being a well-made product that wasn't based on RNG gacha loot boxes to achieve anything of value. I was very done at this point. There hadn't really any basic gameplay updates for a while now outside of these sigils, nothing really to breed outside of the special event breedings, and the base game of DML itself felt stale. Very, very stale. They were relying on mini-events on top of month-long Chrono and Ancient events to keep interest, but I very much was already bored of these long month-long events, and the realization that Dungeon was about to become a staple part of the game was something that really destroyed my own will to play the game. Although, one thing that brought me back into this game, interest-wise, was the great rat infestation of the sigil map, since the sigil map was very broken close to all the time, and also Gameloft reaching out to finally announce they planned to release the Apollo Dragon, alongside myself, after I'd been hashtagging Freeapollo for years, and they never released him in any of the multitude of Divine events that they'd been hosting. This was a very fun time where we got to announce that Apollo was revealed during a live stream, and this was using the new Dragon Master Pass feature, which, on release, I actually didn't mind the Dragon Master Passes for the most part. At the start, players were able to hatch common dragon eggs in order to add to the Dragon Master Pass score, which meant that if you were super busy that month, you could at least pick a day to grind out hatching fire dragon eggs to finish off your Dragon Master Pass. I was really in favour of this, because you could either choose to complete the pass normally, by breeding like limited dragons through the month, or you could do it by hatching fire eggs. It was like Gameloft had finally given some additional choice for how players could complete something in the game. It was whichever way you preferred. Until they removed the ability to hatch common eggs to get points, and now you're forced to breed a specific breed every single month of every single day, just to guarantee that you get enough points in your Dragon Master Pass. Their nerfing of this was unnecessary, and clearly made to force players to buy Dragon Master Pass points if they couldn't finish it. The problem is, new players have tons of stuff to breed, so they don't usually have time to be breeding limited event dragons all the time, so most of them don't even finish off their monthly Dragon Master Passes. Then later on, they added Divines into these passes, which required even more points to unlock, so now tons of new players buy the pass, thinking they can get a free Divine that they desperately need for the dungeon, yet they don't even get close to the amount of points that they need to unlock it. I absolutely despise what they did to Dragon Master Passes. This is outside of them repeatedly nerfing the passes month after month for the first year. They just kept stripping back the rewards repeatedly until they added Divines, of which then they added in Loki and Seth as Divines, which are two of the least useful Divines these days, so a lot of new players get baited into buying the pass for two bad Divines that they'll have to replace anyway, assuming they even successfully finish the pass. This was an awful thing that Gameloft did to the game, outside of it being a battle pass to begin with, meaning that they now had monthly clam subscriptions on sale, on top of monthly Dragon Master Pass subscriptions, on top of any other event spending they expected players to do to get major event rewards, on top of event shrines. It was like they expected the average player to be making 5 or 6 purchases minimum a month to get anything of value out of the game. Unless they're using the most optimal teams with the most optimal sigils and logging in every 6 hours for events. Within a year, the game had gone from 6-hour logins with some gacha chests during events, to everything being a massive pain to add and do, with more RNG, more logging in required, while they stripped away the rewards more and more. This is before even mentioning that during the final Time Rift event, they massively nerfed the castle event and made it outright impossible to complete. Yes, impossible, not doable even if you hit 100% of resets on any of the levels. It was completely undoable. So impossible, in fact, that they had to give everyone thousands of event currency for free because their players were so livid and they'd balanced it so poorly that literally nobody outside of spenders would be able to finish it. They even had to give another additional 10,000 currency in the whale mart to add to the total as well. That's how badly they screwed up the balancing for this event. That was during the final Time Rift, an event that was supposed to be a final goodbye celebration, and they screwed it up that badly. By this point, a lot of players were incredibly frustrated with Gameloft, and rightly so, because it just seems like the development team was hell-bent on removing rewards from events that we expected to get, and then making the event so much more unenjoyable to play as a result. After that, Ruins got another update, the MVP program was released, and we got more Ancient events. The Light Ancient event released, and at the end, on December 7th, 2020, I made a video highlighting all the problems that I had with this event, and Ancient events in general. But at this point, it had become very clear to me that Ancient events had a very, very big problem. They had close to zero leeway of how much you needed to be logging in to get a board dragon. During this Light Ancient event, I missed 8 resets total out of the whole month, which is just 2 days total, and I missed 6 bingos throughout the event. This means that despite logging in for 90% of the event's resets, it wasn't enough to get an Ancient. To make things worse, it's not like I chose to not log in on purpose. I was actually hospitalized, so I missed a day of resets because of this. And that alone was enough to ensure that I got absolutely nothing from the Light Ancient event. Because despite playing the event properly, logging in for resets, and doing as much as I could with my dungeon team at the time, this event was balanced so incredibly poorly that even if you logged in almost every single reset of the event, it wasn't enough to guarantee any of the Ancients. It's not like I was a casual player. I'd been playing for years at this point. I understood how the event worked. I logged in every 6 hours when I possibly could, but still wasn't enough. This was a very dark time for DML, and new players in particular saw these ancient events as impossible to complete and not rewarding enough for the time required to invest into them. To make it worse, the collection dragon was unobtainable too, since they messed with the dragon chest drop odds, and the legendary dragon, Soft, was something unobtainable for the grand majority of players unless you spent or got a full drop. This event was received so badly that Gameloft actually released pieces of Soft at the end of the event to actually make up for it, except they charged players gems for this. For them balancing the event poorly, they forced players to spend gems to get a legendary to get a single collection ancient. It was bad. So very, very bad. And this, along with the Water Ancient event, were two very poor events in DML's history that most long-standing players will tell you were dark times for DML. Very unrewarding, unfun, dark times. After this, there was a slight ray of hope as players had finally started getting more sigils that they needed and really getting to the stage of fully forming their dungeon teams. And at this stage, players found that with a good enough team and sigils of a high enough tier, it was actually possible to finally play the Bottomless Dungeon endlessly. The Bottomless Dungeon finally lived up to its name of being bottomless, and players were able to get thousands and thousands of KOs with their teams, and essentially, as long as they played the dungeon well, they were able to generate an infinite amount of stepping stones. But the big thing to note about this is that doing the dungeon grinding took ages. Hours upon hours upon hours of grinding to get enough stepping stones to guarantee the chest ancient. A lot of players simply didn't bother because it was just such a boring slog. But at the same time, you had to be very aware because later on in the run, even one mistake would cost you and your run would probably end up ending. If you didn't screw up or got lucky, your run could continue and you could keep getting more stepping stones. This was truly the first time DML felt like players had been rewarded for formulating a very specific team with very specific sigils, and then spending hours and hours each day grinding this part of the game to get rewards that before were unobtainable. Getting 11,000 stepping stones in a run wasn't unheard of, and it mostly came down to how focused you could be and how much time you had to grind. But now, you could choose to grind whenever you were available. This was the second time in DML history that you could grind out and do whatever you needed, when you wanted, the other time being the Dragon Master Pass fire hatchings. And so, of course, because players liked this so much, Gameloft had to immediately nerf it. Of course they did. Finally, players felt like they were rewarded for actually playing the game. But because their precious ancient divines had suddenly become obtainable by free-to-play players, if they really put in the effort to put together a good team, they had to remove this. I understand the theory that they don't want to lose out on money because their rewards are too easy to obtain, but it's not like these ancient divines were easy. They required extremely specific dragons with extremely specific sigils and a lot of grinding in that month to get them. They were not easy, nor was it accessible to the majority of players still. But out of fear of their more veteran players getting freebies, this was clearly unacceptable to Gameloft. I will never forgive this, and you will never see Gameloft fix things in the game as fast as they worked to fix the dungeon and no longer make it permanently grindable. They nerfed the Dragon Master Pass rewards a few times, added some new badges, announced some event reworks. Then we got Divine Fests. These brought the return of double castle events, and they actually brought in the Holy Talismans method, which was a much more player-friendly way of being able to collect currency to collect divines. Now, every single chest was guaranteed to drop at least a single talisman, which was much better than the old method, but it was still massively reliant on gacha loot boxes, as the talismans could drop up to times 50s, which had a low drop chance of just 1%. But it felt like DML had gone back to its original divine event routes again, and players were actually feeling more positive about this one. We got the Dragon's Delight events rework, which I didn't like, as it added more layers of RNG and an annoying frenzy bar, and this wasn't really balanced correctly originally, and they ended up having to make more adjustments to this event until it got to an acceptable state. Although, I didn't really enjoy the event myself at any point, but we still had multiple people that could earn the leaderboard rewards, and the frenzy bar could allow for some big scores. But once again, RNG-based events that was reset-based, although 8-hour resets did end up being much better than 6-hour resets. In June 2021, the dragon level cap increased to level 120, and we finally got a new map after a very, very long time. The problem is, Gameloft didn't really seem to take into account sigils, and players finished off this map in less than 20 minutes. So while those 20 minutes were interesting, it was incredibly underwhelming, to say the least. But the other major news was the fact that the Arena and Enchantment League would be merging, which sounded great at the time, as this meant less time taken each day to play both of these. But this would end up being one of the worst updates DML put out for a very long time. And the Enchanted Arena still, in 2020-2023, isn't fixed to this day. Once the new Enchanted Arena released, that's when reality really sunk in for a lot of players. Not only did they remove all of the arena gems that people had been hoarding for years, and we got back nothing but a pittance of gold in exchange, they made it so that we couldn't really get arena energy anymore outside of paying for it. Before, we used to be able to collect arena gems, save them, and spend them all at once on the arena when we wanted to get limited dragons. This wasn't really possible anymore, and it had turned into it turned from slightly pay to win and hoardy to completely and utterly pay to win. The people that can get the highest scores will be those who spend gems, and players could no longer hoard their arena gems to use later, as they'd been removed entirely. This change was absolutely hated by the DML community, with more and more people calling the game a pay-to-win mess. However, this isn't even the biggest problem with the arena, in my opinion. It's the fact that arena opponents no longer had one easy, one medium, and one hard opponent like before. The balancing was actually completely broken. Players that before could do arena fights were now facing 5, 10, 20, even 50 fights in a row against players that they could never even dream of beating because their dragons were 50 levels above them. Gameloft said that they'd fix this at some point, except this never happened until this day. Arena balancing is completely broken and many players cannot win even a few fights in a row. Beyond this, the drop rates for enchantment mats are incredibly low, at least for the high tier ones, and trinkets are still way too difficult to come by. And so, just grinding enough enchantment materials for one single divine now takes months. And depending on your place in the arena, it might even take years. Because the biggest drops happen in the highest enchantment leagues, which require level 100 plus dragons, which the grand majority of players do not possess. At one stage, Gameloft said they were looking into the arena and would see how it was going and then make changes to it, except this never happened. And a year and a half later, this part of the game is still a broken, unrewarding mess that is impossible for a lot of players to even play because their opponents are way too unbalanced. It shows how little they care about this. So now, many players are advised to simply not enchant their dragons because there's no reliable way to do it, and your team will become unbalanced if you do so, which really sucks for those with max level dragons that enchanted them previously. Because now, those players are forced to enchant their team still to remain balanced. So, it can legitimately take years for players with max level dragons to make a new team. It's unbelievably unbalanced, and players have been complaining about this non-stop for the last year, yet it seems Gameloft have absolutely no plans at all to address this. Then, we got Sacred Apples, which are something that was even more out of touch from the developers, but it allows a player to go beyond the max level of 120. which caused a lot of unsuspecting players to accidentally unbalance their teams. The kicker was that only those with max level dragons could even use them, so unless you had at least 3 sacred apples available, it would be a very stupid idea to ever use these items. But of course, some did, and unbalanced their dungeon teams, and did worse in the dungeon. Sacred apples are an item that actively ruins your team for events, yet they put these behind event milestones and leaderboards that many only achieve by spending, so players are expected to actively spend, in a lot of instances, to win sacred apples that make it harder for them to make a good dungeon team. It's not like these apples are an easy supply. They're very difficult to obtain, and they're also not necessary to do well in the arena, so they're often deemed a noob identifier, which isn't exactly a good thing to associate with an item that is often only available to paying players. Outside of the free-to-play apples that you can get in milestones, obviously. They revamped Dragon's Delight events after this, after their first failed attempt, then released a new island, which was pay only. So despite the fact that we hadn't received a new island since the Dungeon Island, we were now getting pay only islands in DML as a default. Players have been desperate for more space for years now because it has been literally years since we received a free-to-play island, yet apparently Gameloft don't care enough about this. Pay or struggle. Then, in January 2022, we got the next new event type. Primal events. An event type that, in theory, should have been my favourite event type in DML because it was described as very casual friendly, and the main theme of these events were dinosaurs! Dinosaur dragons. Who wouldn't love dinosaur dragons? I'd been asking for more dinosaurs for years, so this event, to me, sounded at this stage like the best thing since sliced bread. But nothing can ever be positive when it comes to New Age DML, and so as more details came out, players became more hesitant. Taking a look at the event analysis, it seemed very simple, although players had a couple of concerns. Then the event actually released, and it seemed the quests were easy to complete in just a couple of minutes while being a bit tedious for the hatching quest, but you do those, get shovels, and then you use them on the grid for a chance to find an amulet, which was obviously RNG, but what's DML without RNG? Well, the biggest blessing, but also the biggest problem with this event, which I found out shortly after, is that this event does not have 6-hour resets. It has 12-hour resets. Finally! Gameloft listened! After complaining about 6-hour resets in castle events and dungeon for the last 5 years, Gameloft finally put the 12-hour resets! This was an amazing revelation. Finally we could enjoy our daily lives while also playing this event. But then the realization hit. The amount of shovels we could earn would initially thought to have been every 6 hours. But actually, we'd be getting just half of that, because there would only be 2 resets a day instead of 4. Oh no. Just simply crunching the numbers based on the average amulet drops, it was clear to see that this event had been balanced in a way where it was actually unlikely that any player would get the main reward dragon. Unless they spent money. Which this time was much worse, because rather than being able to use gems to refresh timers, or to do other things in the event, the only option in Primal events is to spend real money to outright buy event bundles. Bundles which didn't even guarantee you would get the dragons you wanted unless you spent an obscene amount. You wanted both of the available new primals? Yeah, spend even more. I could not believe that this event, one that sounded godly in theory, could have been destroyed in such a way. We had never had an event like this with what ended up being a useless element type, where you were not even guaranteed the main reward. Getting both event dragons being pretty much close to statistically impossible without spending heaps of money, things had never been that bad in DML since the original RNG gacha loot boxes from the first Divine events and Chrono events. And let me repeat, Primals ended up being useless, and dragons that can't even fit into your team. So these dragons, which were completely RNG reliant to get, which had an incredibly low chance of getting the main reward, were absolutely useless. They were collection dragons only that would sit on your islands and do nothing. We seriously got to this point in DML where you were spending ridiculous amounts of money to look at a single dragon walk around in a habitat. There is no world in which that is acceptable to me, on top of the other problems, and this event really cemented to me that I never wanted to spend anything in DML ever again. Not that I'd spent anything above $0 in the last couple of years, but instead of spending $20 a year, I knew anything above $0 would be unacceptable for myself, considering how little enjoyment I was getting out of the game anymore. Oh, and Gameloft had the completely wrong description written for the Primal skill, Incapacitating Bite, too, which left players really confused about how it actually works, until it was tested. Another release bug that showed a clear lack of care from the developer's side. We had more Divine Fests, which were okay for the most part. They allowed free-to-play players to get a couple of Divines without too much struggle. They'd finally gotten to the point where players had forgotten about how unrewarding the original castle events were, and these events were, for the most part, deemed as acceptable and palatable enough. But the constant requirement to dungeon grind was it was getting far too boring. They released another Primal event that was essentially exactly the same as the first one. Players were livid and still complaining about the first Primal event, but Gameloft didn't seem to care whatsoever. Despite the fact that players on all forms of social media were complaining about Primal events still, it's like they just chose to ignore it. In May 2022, somehow, after slowly improving their ancient events after the tragedies that were the Light and Water ancient events, they decided to make their ancient events a little worse again, by making Double Troubles even more expensive to complete. And of course, they decided to re-release a very good ancient in that Double Trouble, just to make sure they pissed off enough players, just so that they would be extra angry. Moreso. An ancient that would finally complete the teams for a lot of people, a dragon that people have been waiting to return for a long time. Of course, they had to make his Double Trouble more expensive. Another decision that wasn't looked upon favourably by the players, but some still spent hundreds and hundreds of gems on this because they really did need an ancient of this calibre to finish their team. Because every single event in DML was dungeon reliant now. You wanted good dragons, you absolutely needed a good dungeon team. Our team options had become so limited at this stage, and you had to have good sigils, or your team sucked. DML implemented trade offers into ancient events, which sounded good in theory, and a way to skip the boring slog of rolling dice around the board 500 times. However, of course this had to come with a caveat. Doing so meant that the number of purple tiles you'd hit would be significantly reduced, massively reducing your chances of guaranteeing the ancient board dragon. Of course, they couldn't just add something to reduce the boringness of gameplay. It had to be at the cost of something. At this point, this was just DML. Every good change had to come at the expense of something else. Every team choice had to come at the expense of something, which mainly came down to dropping dragons we actually liked and wanted to use for things that were just strong. Rather than us playing a collecting game and collecting and using dragons we wanted for years now, it had become a game where you really had to use specific dragons to get any value. And it all stemmed from the dungeon and sigil updates. In July 2022, we had the Origin of Energy event, which was a mostly standard ancient event as we knew them. However, a large portion of the player base never really got the chance to experience this event, as Gameloft absolutely failed the APA player base during this event. I haven't even mentioned the constant APA server issues that have been plaguing DML for at least 5 years now, but during the Origin of Energy event, thousands of APA players lost access to their accounts. Of course, they were reporting this to Gameloft, asking when it would be fixed, but this problem just went on and on, with a lot of players only receiving access back to their accounts in week 3 of the Ancient event, meaning that they missed out on almost 3 weeks of that event. If you remember what I said about the Origin of Light event earlier, and about how little leeway you have with these events, missing 3 weeks of an Ancient event basically means you will not get anything from the event at all. They missed out on an entire Ancient event which could have had dragons they needed for their team, an Ancient Divine which may have finished their team. Players were demanding compensation, of course, and upon asking Gameloft to compensate for being unable to play their video game for up to 3 weeks, do you know what Gameloft gave them? 50 gems. They gave them 50 gems max, 5-0, and then said that they wouldn't be giving them anything else as they'd already received compensation. 50 gems, which is a third of the total gems that players used to earn from one singular castle event that lasted 10 days back in 2017. That's how much DML has nerfed their rewards between 2017 and 2022. 50 gems was all that players deserved for missing 3 weeks of an event. This was honestly a gigantic slap in the face to all of these impacted players, and considering all of the server issues on APA are still ongoing, I am absolutely shocked that any APA player has any hope left in Gameloft personally. This was a massive issue, and Gameloft didn't even so much as come out with a proper apology to these players. Players in Ukraine were gifted Divine Ancients and other Ancients because of the war, which I actually did support, but then when it comes to other players who can't play the game because of Gameloft's fault, although these were obviously different circumstances, they weren't even given enough gems for a single premium sigil chest. For the new Primal events, Gameloft increased the starting shovel amounts and also gave shovels and ads that people could collect, which meant that the main reward was just about obtainable if you hit every reset for the month, but it certainly didn't guarantee the main reward dragon. Still, it is down to RNG as to whether you get it. Getting both primals, definitely not doable. But at least some people with okay luck could get the main reward dragon now, which still isn't anywhere near good enough for me. Then, in August 22, we got the Revamped castle events, which actually, for the most part, was full of positive changes, and once again, we were led to believe that Gameloft had finally gone back to their roots. Was this the start of the redemption arc that Gameloft needed? There was now a leaderboard with a badge reward, which was completely meaningless, but it was slightly entertaining, so I didn't mind it. They'd given us the chance to get more divines in castle events again, so that wasn't so bad. And then in the second castle event for that Divine Fest, for some bloody reason, they decided to make it all worse. Everything that was positive about the first part castle event, they made it worse. Stripped back the event, and now players were extra pissed because they'd just had part 1, and that was fine. But then, in less than 2 weeks, they managed to hard nerf the second one. Why? It's not like we were getting a ridiculous amount of rewards from it. Gameloft had just shown the community that they were capable of giving us the first castle event, and it was fresh in everyone's memory, but nope. They had to screw it all up in less than 2 weeks later. I really do think that this was the point where a lot of other players gave up on Gameloft because they're incapable of fixing Arena after over a year, yet they're more than capable of ruining a fine event in less than 2 weeks. It was becoming more and more obvious that this new development team was making these changes on purpose and had no intent to make the game feel any better to play. Oh, and don't forget that the second castle event started so broken that players on certain platforms couldn't even beat the first boss dragon, even though progressing as quickly as possible in castle events is integral to success. So, you can earn more currency later on. So they compensated players that were stuck with a currency amount that wasn't enough to make up for the potential currency loss by playing the event. Thank you. Nice one, Gameloft. We also got energy changes. Energy changes that made it so that we went from our 200 portal gem cap to 0. Changes that players in the community were not very pleased about. These portal gems had gone from originally being infinite to now being removed entirely. Instead, we got a different energy system, and one that relies on overcharged energy. If you spend all of your energy, there is no way to get more energy if you need it, which became a huge problem in the newly revamped castle events when some players simply did not have enough energy to do all of the fights that they needed. However, for those that simply saved and hoarded energy and didn't spend it after receiving gifts, they were now able to essentially overcharge their energy into the thousands. But this relies on players no longer using their energy actively, which means not doing as many blue map battles potentially, not going and getting the bonus gold and food every day, which forced players to play the campaign less to make sure that they had enough for events. I said it at the time, but I did see this as another moment in DML where this looked bleak and didn't paint a very good picture for DML going forward. Although one benefit of this energy change was that players could now hire dragons much stronger than them, because if they did save up for overcharged energy, they could now hire whoever they wanted. But this does come at the expense of their regularly spawned energy. And plus we had ×4 speed, which was making everything a lot faster in the game. A hell of a lot faster than it used to be. It was a very, very good thing for the game. Then, in September 2022, we had the Pet Influencer Primal event, which gave us 3 new Primals, but you could immediately unlock any of the Primals you wanted with just a single currency. This used online pet influencers as unlockable dragons, similarly to the very old charity events, but this was in their new Primal event style. Getting a free Primal that was cute was a good part of this event, and perhaps this was used as a way to draw more people into caring about Primal events, but fundamentally, the event was still the same RNG boring mess from before, and there still weren't enough shovels to get all of the rewards. So even though this was a pet influencer event, he still couldn't get all of the special reward dragons. It's just so much less rewarding than the old events of the same type, and if anything, this made even more players realize just how unrewarding Primal events are compared to the old school DML events from years gone. Then of course, the final, newest, major event type that DML released, which, in my opinion, has finally cemented the beginning of the end for DML. Tyrant events. December 2022 was the first Tyrant event, and these Tyrant dragons were made to be equal to Divines and Ancients, but more defensive based, so more tanky than anything before. We have the brand new Dragon Grid event, which has you go through various grids, using energy to get tickets that you then open to get talismans to spend on your Tyrants. Except the event is massively RNG based, and your overall progress is helped massively by getting the Dungeon Dragon every single week as early as possible to using the Dragon Grid. At first, it seemed like you'd be okay using the basic Fire Dragon, but since your progress and unlocking more energy is directly tied to your current grid level, making as much progress as possible as quickly as possible is key, and the lovely, lovely DML devs made this event incredibly RNG based, so that each tile that spawns in is random. Lovely. So even though the event starts by one of the characters saying, "Use your brain and you'll be fine," you in fact will not be fine if you get bad RNG, which can have you failing levels multiple times even before you reach level 10, purely through getting poor RNG. Plus there's also the RNG on the tickets themselves and the fact that they nerfed the drops from the tickets too, so you'll be getting fewer talismans than you would have done from the later Divine Fests. Plus, Gameloft themselves admitted that free-to-play, you'll be looking at 1 to 2 Tyrants max, really. 1 if you play for the entire event, every 4 weeks. 2 if you play for the entire event, and if you get good luck or spend some money. 4 is simply realistically impossible. In fact, even if you spend money on multiple bundles, getting all 4 event Tyrants is very, very difficult. You have to spend big money and big gems to get Tyrannos, which, hilariously, they made a pretty bad dragon because they gave him the legendary element without ever buffing the legendary element, which has been incredibly useless as an element for years now. So once again, you spend stupid money to get, essentially, a bad dragon. Players have been utterly furious about this event for weeks. Before the Tyrant event was released, people weren't happy. Then when it released, they found the event to be even worse than expected in a lot of ways. Any social media that is DML related, you will see people complaining about how bad this Tyrant event was, how pay to win it was, how bored they are of the game. What has Gameloft said in the final week of the Tyrant event? Absolutely nothing. They may make more statements next year after the Tyrant event is over, but the damage has very much already been done. The players were essentially ignored for 4 weeks of this event, despite complaining incessantly everywhere that they possibly could about how much they do not like this event. Yet, even though they can increase drop rates in week 2 of the event so easily, what else did they do at week 2 at the same time? They made the grid harder. Again, never anything positive without something negative. They just absolutely refuse as a company to give their players more rewards, even if they've cut down the rewards that they can 100-fold. They even nerfed the chests in the Tyrant event, so rather than players getting a decent amount of food from the event chests, they nerfed this, and they nerfed the talisman drops. Why? They could have kept them the same as the previous events, and they still would have been awful and not very rewarding. Yep, this is DML, where absolutely nobody feels rewarded, whether they be new players, whales, or light-spending dolphins. Nobody wins in DML anymore. And if as many players do leave at the end of this Tyrant event as say they will, the developers won't win either, because it will be very, very difficult to bring those players back and make up to the existing players that have been complaining for weeks about the Tyrant event with no feedback given at all. Gameloft have said that they're working on revamping clans, and there are also rumours circulating about the upcoming events that will bring back Divines and Ancients, but for me, all of this seems to be way too late. We haven't had a clan update in years now, and even if you revamp it at this point, if too many of the players end up leaving after the Tyrant event because of unenjoyable events alongside that, any existing hope in the devs will be at an all-time low. These clan changes would have to be absolutely amazing to bring back the audience's attention. At least that's what it looks like to me at this point. Unless the return of Divines and Ancient is in a super free-to-play way so that players can make good dungeon teams again, that will utterly destroy the current players that are trying to play the game without a Divine. Unless they somehow balance sigils properly in 2023 so that we can use more than just Wonder Acceptance and things like the dungeon, but that's seeming less and less likely. As I stated before, I lost 100% of my faith in Gameloft as a company, despite being in some of their in-game events, despite playing this game for just under 8 years, despite defending Gameloft on different occasions, despite playing some of these god-awful events at the end and giving them a decent try. There's no excuse for how much worse this game has gotten since the castle events back in 2017. Just comparing the rewards for events that took far less time, that had more leeway, they got more exciting than now. DML is such a different game, and not in a good way. So while DML continues to be less rewarding and piss off the players more and more, other new games will be releasing. Other games will be improving their products. Other games will be becoming more rewarding, releasing more multiplayer permanently replayable features that don't rely on event resets to be played. Yet DML seems hellbent in going the opposite direction. That, for me, is enough to say that DML truly is shit. And I believe that 95% of you that moved on from from DML to their direct competitors even, would have a more enjoyable experience. That doesn't mean you have to, but that's my honest opinion considering the state the game is in now. Either way, I hope this timeline of everything major that happened in DML gives you some insight into how things have changed, and ultimately, why I lost faith in the game in the end. 8 years of what could have been growth in this game ultimately turned into more boredom, more annoyance, and more RNG, which is everything wrong with mobile gaming, and it's why I hate mobile gaming as a whole. 5 minutes is too much time to waste playing, air quotes, a game as unrewarding and unfun as DML. So I wish you the best, and I do sincerely hope Gameloft can improve the game for the existing players, but until they get to a point like the 2016-2017 DML rewards and events again, that will never ever happen.